Good evening, and welcome to Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's installment provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep for once. So lie back, adjust your volume, take a nice deep breath, and off we go. This evening, we're reading one of the first works of science fiction ever written. It's Somnium, or The Dream, by the great mathematician and astronomer Johannes Kepler, written in 1608. Let's begin. In the year 1608, when quarrels were raging between the brothers, Emperor Rudolph and Archduke Matthias, people were comparing precedents from Bohemian history. Caught up by the general curiosity, I applied my mind to Bohemian legends and chanced upon the story of the heroine Libussa, famous for her magic art. It happened then on a certain night that after watching the stars and moon, I stretched out on my bed and fell sound asleep. In my sleep, I seemed to be reading a book I had got from the market. This was how it went. My name is Duracotis. My homeland is Iceland, which the ancients called Thule. Because of the recent death of my mother, Fiolzilda, I am free to write of something which I have long wanted to write about. While she lived, she earnestly entreated me to remain silent. She used to say that there are many wicked folk who despise the arts and interpret maliciously everything their own dull minds cannot grasp. They fasten harmful laws onto the human race, and many, condemned by those laws, have been swallowed by the abysses of Hecla. My mother never told me my father's name, but she said he was a fisherman, and that he died at the very old age of 150 years, when I was 3, after about 70 years of marriage. In my early childhood, my mother often would lead me by the hand, or lift me onto her shoulders and carry me to Hecla's lower slopes. These excursions were made especially around the time of the Feast of St. John, when the sun, occupying the sky for the whole 24 hours, leaves no room for night. Gathering various herbs there, she took them home and brewed them with elaborate ceremonies, stuffing them afterward into little goatskin sacks, which she sold in the nearby harbor to sailors on ships as charms. In this way, she made a living. Once, out of curiosity, I cut open a pouch unbeknownst to my mother, who was in the act of selling it, and the herbs and patches of embroidered cloth she had put inside it scattered all about. Angry with me for cheating her out of payment, she gave me to the captain in place of the little pouch, so that she might keep the money. And he, setting out unexpectedly next day with a favorable wind, headed as if for Bergen in Norway. After several days, a north wind came up. Blown off course between Norway and England, he headed for Denmark and traversed the strait, since he had a letter from a bishop of Iceland for Tycho Brahe, the Dane, who was living on the island of Fen. I became violently seasick from the motion and the unusual warmth of the breeze, for I was in fact a youth of only 14. After the boat reached shore, the captain left me and the letter with an island fisherman, and having given me hope of his return, set sail. Brahe, greatly delighted with the letter I gave him, began to ask me many questions which I, unfamiliar with the language, did not understand except for a few words. He therefore imposed upon his students, whom he supported in great numbers, the task of talking with me frequently, So it came about through this generosity of Brahe and a few weeks' practice that I spoke Danish fairly well. I was no less ready to talk than they were to question, and I told them many new things about my homeland in return for the marvels they related to me. Finally, the captain of the ship that had brought me returned, but when he came to fetch me, he was sent away, and I was very happy. The astronomical exercises pleased me greatly. Brahe and his students passed whole nights with wonderful instruments fixed on the moon and stars. This reminded me of my mother because she too used to commune constantly with the moon. Thus by chance I, who came from very impoverished circumstances in a half-barbaric land, achieved an understanding of the most divine sciences, which has prepared the way for me to greater things. After I had passed several years on the island, I was seized with a desire to see my home again. I thought it would be no difficult matter for me, with the knowledge that I had acquired, to attain some high office among my rude countrymen. Therefore, after obtaining my patron's approval for my departure, I left him and went to Copenhagen. There, some travelers who wanted to learn the language in the region took me into their company. With them, I returned to my native land 5 years after I had left it. I was most happy to find my mother still alive, still engaged in the same pursuits as before, and the sight of me, unharmed and thriving, brought an end to her prolonged regret at having rashly sent her son away. Autumn was approaching, and the nights were lengthening toward the time in Christ's natal month, when the sun appears only briefly at midday before straightway hiding itself again. During this holiday from her labors, my mother clung to me continually. Wherever I betook myself with my letters of recommendation, she did not leave my side. She kept asking me, now about the lands which I had visited, and now about the sky. She delighted in the knowledge I had acquired about the sky. She compared my reports of it with discoveries she herself had made about it. She said she was ready to die, since her knowledge, her only possession, would now be left to her son and heir. By nature eager for knowledge, I asked about her arts, and what teachers she had had in a land so far removed from others. One day, when there was a time for conversation, she told me everything from the beginning, much as follows. "Duracotis, my son," she said, "provision has been made not only for the regions you have visited, but for our land too. For although we have cold and darkness and other inconveniences, which now at last I am aware of when I learn from you the delights of other regions, we are none the less well endowed with natural ability, and there are present among us very wise spirits who, finding the noise of the multitude and the excessive light of other regions irksome, seek the solace of our shadows and communicate with us as friends. 9 of these spirits are especially worthy of note. 1, particularly friendly to me, most gentle and purest of all, is called forth by 21 characters. With his help, I am transported in a moment of time to any foreign shore I choose, or, if the distance is too great for me, I learn as much by asking him as I would by going there myself. Most of what you have seen or learned from conversations or drawn from books, he has already reported to me, just as you have. I should like you to go with me now to a region he has talked to me about many times, for what he has told me is indeed marvelous. She called it Lavanya. Straight away I agreed that she should summon her teacher. It was now spring. The moon, becoming crescent, began to shine as soon as the sun dropped below the horizon, and it was joined by the planet Saturn in the sign of Taurus just after sunset. My mother withdrew from me to a nearby crossroads, and after crying aloud a few words in which she set forth her desire, she returned, right hand outstretched, palm upward, and sat down beside me. Scarcely had we got our heads covered with our robes, as was the agreement, when there arose a hollow, indistinct voice, speaking in Icelandic to this effect. The demon from Lavanya. 50,000 German miles up in the air, the island of Lavanya lies. The road to it from here, or from it to the earth, seldom lies open for us. Indeed, when it does, it is easy for us, but for men the passage is exceedingly difficult, and made at grave risk to life. No inactive persons are accepted into our company. We choose only those who have spent their lives on horseback, or have shipped often to the Indies and are accustomed to subsisting on hardtack, garlic, dried fish, and such unpalatable fare. Especially suited are dried-up old crones, who since childhood have ridden over great stretches of the earth at night in tattered cloaks on goats or pitchforks. No Germans are suitable, but we do not despise the lean, hard bodies of the Spaniards. The whole of the journey is accomplished in the space of 4 hours at most, for busy as we always are, we agree not to leave before the eastern edge of the moon begins to go into eclipse. If the moon should shine forth full while we are still en route, our departure would be in vain. On such a headlong dash, we can take few human companions, only those who are most respectful of us. We congregate in force and seize a man of this sort. Altogether lifting him from beneath, we carry him aloft. The first getting into motion is very hard on him, for he is twisted and turned just as if, shot from a cannon, he were sailing across mountains and seas. Therefore, he must be put to sleep beforehand with narcotics and opiates, and he must be arranged limb by limb so that the shock will be distributed over the individual members, lest the upper part of his body be carried away from the fundament, or his head be torn from his shoulders. Then comes a new difficulty, terrific cold and difficulty in breathing. The former we counter with our innate power, the latter by means of moistened sponges applied to the nostrils. When the first part of the trip is accomplished, the carrying becomes easier. Then we entrust the bodies to the empty air and withdraw our hands. The bodies roll themselves together into balls as spiders do, and we carry them almost by means of our will alone. Finally, the corporeal mass heads of its own accord for the appointed place. But this spontaneous motion is not very useful because it occurs too slowly. Therefore, as I have said, we hurry the bodies along by willpower, and then we precede them, lest some damage be inflicted by a very hard impact on the moon. When the men awaken, they usually complain about unspeakable weariness in all their limbs, but they later entirely recover from this so that they can walk. Many further difficulties arise which would be too numerous to recount. Absolutely no harm befalls us, for we stay in close array within the shadow of the earth, however long it is, until the shadow reaches Lavanya, where we disembark as if from a ship. There we betake ourselves hurriedly to caves and to shadowy regions, in order that the sun, coming out into the open a little later, may not overwhelm us and drive us from our intended lodging and force us to follow the departing shadow. We are granted a truce for exercising our talents as the spirit moves us. We confer with the demons of this province, and entering into an alliance with them, as soon as a place begins to lack the sun, we join forces and spread out into the shadow. If the shadow of the moon strikes the earth with its sharp point, as generally happens, we too attack the earth with our allied armies. This can be done at no other time than when men see the sun go into eclipse. It is for this reason that men so greatly fear eclipses of the sun. So much for the trip to Lavanya. Now, let me tell you about the place itself, starting as geographers do, with those things which are determined by the heavens. Although all of Lavanya has the same view of the fixed stars as we have, it has nevertheless such a different view of the motions and sizes of the planets that it must surely have a wholly different system of astronomy. Just as our geographers divide the Earth's circle into 5 zones with respect to heavenly phenomena, so Lavanya consists of 2 hemispheres, one subvulva, the other prevulva. The former always enjoys vulva, which is to it what our moon is to us, while the latter is forever deprived of the sight of vulva. A circle dividing the hemispheres in the manner of our solstitial couleur, i.e., a circle on the celestial sphere which passes through the poles and solstices, passes through the cosmic poles and is called the divider, because it divides subvulva from prevulva, passes through the cosmic poles and is called the divider, because it divides subvulva from prevulva. I shall first set forth the features that are common to both hemispheres. All of Lavanya experiences the same succession of days and nights as we do, but in the year as a whole, the people there lack our annual variation. For throughout Lavanya, the days are almost equal to the nights, except that each day is by the same fixed amount shorter than the night for prevulva and longer for subvulva. What variation there is in the course of 8 years will be told below. Now, at both poles, the sun, balancing between day and night, circles around the mountains of the horizon, half of it hidden and half of it shining. For Lavanya seems to its inhabitants to be stationary, while the stars go around it, just as the earth seems to us to be stationary. A night and a day joined together equal one of our months. For in fact, when the sun is about to rise in the morning, almost a whole sign of the zodiac is visible that was not visible the day before. And just as for us in 1 year there are 365 revolutions of the sun, and 366 of the sphere of fixed stars, or to be more precise, in 4 years there are 1,461 revolutions of the sun, but 1,465 revolutions of the fixed stars. So for those on Lavanya, the sun revolves 12 times in 1 year, and the sphere of the fixed stars 13 times in 1 year. To be more precise, in 8 years the sun goes round 99 times, the sphere of the fixed stars 107 times. But a cycle of 19 years, the so-called Metonic cycle, is more familiar to them, for in that number of years the sun rises 235 times, but the fixed stars rise 254 times. The sun rises in the centermost part of the region of subvulva when the last quarter of the moon appears to us, but it shines in the centermost part of prevulva when the first quarter of the moon appears to us. These things that I say in regard to the middle regions are to be understood also with respect to the whole of the semicircles drawn through the poles and the mid-regions at right angles to the divider. You could call these the semicircles of the media vulva, the central meridian of subvulva. Now there is a circle halfway between the poles that performs the function of our earthly equator, by which name it shall accordingly be called. It cuts in half both the divider and the media vulva at opposite points, and the sun daily passes almost directly through the zenith of whatever places lie on this circle, and it passes exactly over it on 2 opposite days of the year at noon. In the regions that lie toward either pole, the sun at midday declines from the zenith. They have on Lavanya also some alternation of summer and winter, but this cannot be compared with ours in variety, nor does it always occur in the same places at the same time of year, as is the case with us. For it happens that in the space of 10 years, their summer moves from one part of the sidereal year to the opposite part in the same location. For in the cycle of 19 sidereal years, or 235 Lavanian days, toward the poles summer occurs 20 times and winter the same number, whereas they occur 40 times at the equator. They have annually 6 days of summer, the rest winter, corresponding to our months of summer and winter. That alternation is scarcely noticed near the equator, because there the sun does not deviate more than 5 degrees to either side of the zenith at noon. It is felt more near the poles, since the regions there either have sunlight or lack it in alternate half-year periods, just as is the case on Earth with those who live at either of the poles. Thus the globe of Lavanya also consists of 5 zones, which correspond in a certain manner to our terrestrial zones. But the tropical zone extends barely 10 degrees, as do likewise the Arctic zones. All the rest are similar in extent to our temperate zones. The tropical zone passes through the mid-parts of the hemispheres, half its longitude, that is, through subvulva, and the other half through prevulva. In the sections of the circle of the equator and the zodiac, there exist also 4 chief points, as we have the equinoctial points and the solstitial points. And from these sections the circle of the zodiac begins. But the motion of the fixed stars in natural succession from this beginning is very swift, since in 20 tropical years, years that is, designated by 1 summer and 1 winter each, they travel through the whole zodiac, which happens with us but once in 26,000 years. So much for the first motion. The calculation of the second motion is no less diverse in the case of motions which they see than it is in the case of motions that we see, and it is much more complicated. For all 6 planets, Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, experience, in addition to all the irregularities that are familiar to us, 3 others, 2 in longitude, 1 daily, the other in a cycle of 8.5 years, and the third in latitude, in a cycle of 19 years. For in the mid-regions of prevulva, the sun is larger when it is their midday than when it is their sunrise, other things being equal. And in subvulva it is smaller. The dwellers in both areas think that the sun deviates several minutes from the ecliptic in each direction, now toward these and now toward those fixed stars. And these deviations have a pattern that is repeated, as I have said, in 19 years. However, this wandering concerns prevulva slightly more and subvulva slightly less, and although by the first motion the sun and fixed stars are considered as proceeding with even gait around Lavanya, nevertheless, for prevulva the sun at midday advances hardly at all in relation to the fixed stars. But to those in subvulva it is very swift at noon. The contrary is true at midnight, and thus the sun seems to make certain leaps under the fixed stars, separate leaps on separate days. These same deviations occur in the motions of Venus, Mercury, and Mars. In the case of Jupiter and Saturn, they are almost imperceptible. Yet this diurnal motion is not consistent at identical hours each day, but sometimes it is slower, both in the case of the sun and of the fixed stars, and then faster in the opposite part of the year in exactly the same hour of the day. And that slowness, making a complete circuit in the space of a little less than 9 years, makes its way through the days of the year, so that now it takes place on a summer's day, and now on a winter's day, which in another year had experienced swiftness. Thus now the day, now in turn the night, is made longer by a natural slowness, and not, as with us on earth, by the unequal division of the circle of the natural day. If this slowness befalls the Privolven region in the middle of the night, an excess of night over day is accumulated. But if it happens in the day, then night and day become more equal, which comes about once in 9 years. The situation is reversed in subvulva. So much then for those features which are in a certain manner common to the 2 hemispheres. Concerning the Privolven hemisphere. Now, as to the features that are unique in each hemisphere, there is great difference between them. It is not just that the presence and absence of vulva result in such different spectacles, but even the common phenomena themselves have very different effects in one region from what they have in the other, to such an extent that perhaps it would be more correct to call the Privolven hemisphere non-temperate, and the subvulvan hemisphere temperate. For in Privolva, the night is as long as 15 or 16 of our natural days. It is gloomy with perpetual darkness, like that of our moonless nights, for it is never illuminated by any rays of vulva. Therefore, everything is stiff with cold and frost, and there are besides very strong, sharp winds. There follows a day as long as 14 of our days, or a little less, when the sun is quite big and slow-moving with respect to the fixed stars, and there are no winds. Accordingly, there is immeasurable heat, and thus for a space of one of our months, which is a Lavanian day, there is in one and the same place heat 15 times more burning than our African heat, and cold more intolerable than of Quivira. It must be especially noted that the planet Mars, in the mid-regions of Privolva in the middle of the night, and in other Privolvan areas, each in its own part of the night, appears almost twice as big as it does to us. Concerning the subvulvan hemisphere. Passing over to this hemisphere, I shall begin with those who dwell on its border, that is, at the divider circle. For it is peculiar to them they see the elongations of Venus and Mercury from the sun as being much greater than we do. At certain times, even Venus appears twice as big to them as it does to us, especially to those who live near the northern pole. But the most pleasant thing of all in Lavania is contemplation of vulva, the sight of which the dwellers there enjoy in place of our moon, which is entirely lacking to those in both subvulva and prevulva. And the subvulvan region is so designated from the constant presence of vulva, just as the other is called prevulva from the absence of vulva, because the dwellers there are deprived of the sight of vulva. When our moon is rising full and advancing above the distant houses, it seems to us earth dwellers to equal the circumference of a wine cask. When it ascends to the meridian, it displays the breadth scarcely of a human countenance. But when vulva is in the middle of the sky, a position it has for those who live in the very center or navel of this hemisphere, it seems to the dwellers in subvulva a little less than 4 times greater in diameter than our moon does to us, so that if one were to compare the 2 disks, vulva would be 15 times bigger than our moon. But to those for whom vulva hangs perpetually at the horizon, it presents the appearance of a mountain on fire at a distance. Just as we distinguish regions according to greater or lesser elevations of the pole, granted that we do not perceive the pole itself with our eyes, so the altitude of the ever-visible vulva, differing from place to place, serves the same purpose for them. For, as I have said, vulva stands overhead at the zenith for some, and for others appears low near the horizon. For the rest, it varies in altitude from the zenith to the horizon, but always in any given place, the altitude is constant. They also have their own poles, however. These are not at those fixed stars which mark our cosmic poles in the sky, but are in the region of other stars, which are for us indicators of the poles of the ecliptic. In the space of 19 lunar years, these poles of the moon-dwellers move in small circles around the poles of the ecliptic, in the constellation of Draco, and the opposite constellations of the Swordfish, and of the Sparrow, and of the Greater Nebula. Since these poles of the moon-dwellers are distant from vulva by almost a quarter of a circle, their regions can be marked off both according to the poles and according to vulva. It is obvious how they outstrip us in respect of convenience, for they indicate the longitude of places by means of their unmoving vulva, and the latitude by means both of vulva and the poles, while we have nothing for longitudes, except that insignificant and scarcely discernible declination of our compass needles. For them, then, vulva stands in the sky as if fixed by a nail, and above it the other stars and the sun pass from east to west. There is no night in which some of the fixed stars in the zodiac do not betake themselves behind vulva and emerge again on the opposite side. However, the same fixed stars do not do this every night. All those which are within 6 degrees or 7 degrees of the ecliptic take turns. A cycle is completed in 19 years, at the end of which time the first stars return to the place they had in the beginning. Vulva waxes and wanes no less than our moon, the cause being the same, the presence of the sun or its departure. Even the time is the same if you look to nature, but they reckon in one way, we in another. They consider as a day and a night the time in which all the waxings and wanings of their vulva occur. We call this amount of time a month. Because of its size and brightness, vulva is almost never, even in its new phase, concealed from the subvulvans. It is especially visible in the polar regions, which lack the sun at the time. There, at midday, vulva turns its horns upward. In general, for those living between vulva and the poles on the mid-vulvan circle, new vulva is the sign of midday, the first quarter the sign of evening, full vulva at midnight, the last quarter of sunrise. For those who have both vulva and the poles situated on the horizon, and live where the equator and the divider intersect, morning or evening comes with new and full vulva, noon and midnight with the quarters. From these examples, one may take judgments also concerning those who live in between. They even distinguish the hours of the day according to this or that phase of vulva. The closer noon approaches to the former, and evening or sunset to the latter. During the night, which regularly lasts as long as 14 of our days and nights, they are much better equipped to measure time than we are. For apart from that succession of the phases of vulva of which we have said, full vulva is an indication of midnight to the region of media vulva. Vulva itself also marks off the hours for them, for although it appears not to move at all from its place, unlike our moon, it nevertheless turns like a wheel in its place and displays a remarkable variety of spots, one after the other, these spots moving along constantly from east to west. One such revolution, in which the same spots return, is considered by the subvolvans as 1 hour of time, although it equals somewhat more than 1 day and 1 night of ours. And this is the only constant measure of time. For as was said above, the daily journey of the sun and the stars around the moon dwellers is irregular, as is shown perhaps especially by this rotation of vulva, if it were to be compared with the elongations of the fixed stars from the moon. In general, as far as its upper northern region is concerned, vulva seems to have 2 halves. One is darker and covered with almost continuous spots. The other is a little brighter, with a shining girdle flowing between and dividing the 2 halves to the north. The shape is difficult to explain. In the eastern part is what looks like the front of a human head cut off at the shoulders, approaching a young girl with a long dress to kiss her. She, with her hand extended backward, is enticing a cat that is jumping up. However, the bigger and wider part of the spot extends westward without any clear shape. In the other half of vulva, the brightness is more widespread than the spot. You might say that there was a likeness of a bell hanging from a rope and swinging westward. What there is above and below cannot be likened to anything. Not only does vulva in this way mark off the hours of the day for them, but it even gives clear evidence of the seasons of the year to anyone who is paying attention and who fails to notice the positions of the fixed stars. For even at the time when the sun occupies Cancer, vulva clearly shows the northern pole of its revolutions. Appearing in the middle of the bright area, above the figure of the girl, there is a certain small dark spot, which moves from the highest and outermost part of vulva toward the east, and thence descending into the disk toward the west, from which extreme it moves again back to the upper part of vulva toward the east, and so is then always visible. But when the sun is occupying Capricorn, this spot is nowhere visible, the whole circle with its pole being hidden behind the body of vulva. And in these 2 seasons of the year, the spots head in a straight line for the west, but in the times between when the sun is in the east, that is, established in Libra, the spots descend or ascend transversely in a somewhat curved line. From this evidence we know that while the center of the body of vulva remains still, the poles of this rotation travel in a polar circle around their own pole once in a year. The more diligent notice also that vulva is not always the same size, for in those hours of the day in which the stars are swift, the diameter of vulva is much greater, so that then it is more than 4 times as large as that of our moon. Now what shall I say about eclipses of the sun and of vulva, which occur also on Lavania, and at the same moments in which eclipses of the sun and the moon occur here on the globe of the earth, but plainly for opposite reasons. For when we see the whole sun go into eclipse, vulva goes into eclipse for them. When in turn our moon goes into eclipse, the sun is eclipsed for them. Not everything matches exactly, however, for they often see partial eclipses of the sun when we are having no eclipse of the moon, and, on the other hand, they often experience no eclipse of vulva when we are having partial eclipses of the sun. Eclipses of vulva occur for them at the time of full vulva, as eclipses of the moon do for us at the time of the full moon. But eclipses of the sun take place at the time of new vulva, as for us at the time of the new moon. Since they have such long days and nights, they experience very frequent darkenings of both heavenly bodies. Whereas with us, a great part of eclipses cross over to our antipodes, Their antipodes, which are in fact prevulva, see absolutely nothing of these. The dwellers in subvulva alone see them all. They do not ever see a total eclipse of vulva, but they see a certain small spot, which is ruddy at the edges and black in the middle, go across the body of vulva. This spot enters from the east of vulva and leaves by the western edge, taking the same course in fact as the spots that are native to vulva, but surpassing them in speed, and it lasts a sixth part of their hour, or 4 of our hours. Vulva is the cause of their solar eclipses, as our moon is the cause of ours. Since vulva has a diameter 4 times larger than that of the sun, it is a necessary consequence that when the sun moves from the east or the south behind the motionless vulva and to the west, it very frequently goes behind vulva, and thus the sun's body, either in part or as a whole, is hidden by vulva. The occultation of the sun's body, moreover, frequent though it is nevertheless very remarkable, because it lasts several of our hours, and the light of both the sun and vulva is extinguished at the same time. It must certainly be an impressive thing for the dwellers in subvulva, whose nights otherwise are not much darker than days on account of the splendor and size of the ever-present vulva, when during an eclipse of the sun, both luminaries, the sun and vulva, are extinguished for them. Their eclipses of the sun have this singular feature, which happens quite often. Scarcely is the sun hidden behind the body of vulva, when from the opposite side appears a shining, as if the sun has become enlarged and embraced the whole body of vulva, when otherwise the sun regularly appears so much smaller than vulva. There is, therefore, not always complete darkness, unless the centers of the bodies are almost completely aligned, and the arrangement of the transparent middle part, that is, the atmosphere, allows it. But vulva is not so suddenly extinguished that it cannot be seen at all, though the whole sun hides behind it, except just at the midpoint of a total eclipse. At the beginning of a total eclipse, at certain places on the divider, vulva still shows white, as if a living coal remained after a fire has been put out. When this whiteness is also extinguished, it is the middle of a total eclipse, for in a partial eclipse the whiteness remains. And when the whiteness of vulva returns at opposite points of the divider circle, there comes a view also of the sun, so that thus, in a certain manner, both luminaries are extinguished at the same time in the middle of a total eclipse. So much for the phenomena in both hemispheres of Lavanya, subvulva and prevulva. It is not difficult to judge from this, even without my saying anything, how much the subvulvan hemisphere differs from the prevulvan hemisphere in other respects. For although the subvulvan night is as long as 14 of our day-night periods, nevertheless the presence of vulva brightens the land and protects it from cold. Certainly, such a mass and such brightness cannot fail to produce heat. On the other hand, though, the subvulvan region has the troublesome presence of the sun for 15 or 16 of our days and nights. Still, the sun, being smaller, is not dangerously strong, and the luminaries in combination lure all the water to that hemisphere, and the land is submerged, so that very little stands up above water, while the prevulvan hemisphere, on the other hand, is dry and cold, since, of course, all the water has been drawn away. When, however, night approaches the subvulvan area, and day comes to prevulva, since the luminaries are divided between the hemispheres, so also is the water, and the fields of subvulva are laid bare, but moisture is provided to prevulva as a slight compensation for the heat. All Lavania does not exceed 1,400 German miles in circumference, only a fourth part of our Earth. Nevertheless, it has high mountains and very deep and broad valleys, and thus falls far short of Earth in perfect roundness. Moreover, the whole of it, especially in the Privolvan tracts, is porous and pierced through, as it were, with hollows and continuous caves, which are the chief protection of the inhabitants against heat and cold. Whatever is born from the soil or walks on the soil is of prodigious size. Growth is very quick. Everything is short-lived, although it grows to such enormous bodily bulk. The Privolvans have no settled dwellings, no fixed habitation. They wander in hordes over the whole globe in the space of one of their days, some on foot, whereby they far outstrip our camels, some by means of wings, some in boats pursue the fleeing waters, or if a pause of a good many days is necessary, then they creep into caves. Each acts according to its nature. Most creatures can dive. All breathing beings naturally draw their breath very slowly, and therefore aiding nature by means of art, they live deep down under the water. For they say that in those deep recesses of water, cold water remains, while the upper waves are heated by the sun, and whatever clings to the surface is boiled by the sun at midday, and becomes food for the approaching swarms of wandering inhabitants. For, on the whole, the subvolvan hemisphere is comparable to our villages, towns, and gardens. The Privolvan hemisphere is like our fields and woods and deserts. Those to whom breathing is more necessary introduce the hot water into the caves by means of a narrow canal, in order that, being taken into the innermost parts through a long course, the water may gradually become cool. They stay there for the greater part of the day, and use the water for drinking, and when evening approaches they go forth to seek food. In the case of plants, bark; in the case of animals, skin, or whatever may take its place, accounts for the major part of the corporeal mass, and it is spongy and porous. If anything is caught in the daylight, it becomes hard and burnt on top, and when evening approaches, the outer covering comes off. Things growing from the soil, although on the mountain ridges there are few, are usually produced and destroyed on the same day, new growth springing up daily. A race of serpents predominates in general. It is wonderful how they expose themselves to the sun at midday as if for pleasure, but only just inside the mouths of caves, in order that there might be a safe and convenient retreat. Creatures whose breath has been exhausted and life extinguished through the heat of the day return at night, in a contrary fashion to the way flies do with us. For scattered here and there on the ground are masses in the shape of pine nuts, which have parched shells in the daytime, but in the evening, when the hiding places open up, as it were, they put forth living creatures. The chief alleviation of the heat in the subvolvan hemisphere is the constant cloudiness and rains, which sometimes prevail throughout half the region or more. When I had arrived at this point in my dreaming, a wind accompanied by the sound of rain came along and dissolved my sleep, and destroyed along with it the last part of that book obtained at Frankfurt. And so, having taken leave of the demon who was speaking and of the audience, Duracotus the sun with his mother Theosilda, even as they had their heads covered, so I came to my senses, to find my head in fact covered by a pillow, my body wrapped in bedclothes. Well, that wasn't quite what I was expecting. It seems science fiction's come quite a distance since 1608. Hopefully, you're no longer awake to hear this. But if you are, and you'd like something else to do besides contemplate elliptical planes, perhaps you'd consider joining some of your fellow listeners in leaving us a positive review on iTunes. It's very helpful. If you'd like to read this work for yourself, check out our Goodreads page, where we keep a library of everything read on this podcast. Just go to goodreads.com/boringbooksforbedtime. If you'd like to connect or suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, catch us on Twitter @boringbookspod. And if you'd like to support this podcast, we do have a Patreon. Just go to patreon.com and type in Boring Books for Bedtime to see some of the perks we offer to supporters. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. It's much appreciated. Until our next boring book, good night.